What's happening, folks? Geologist Philip Prince talking about a real geologic mystery in the Appalachian Mountains today. You're looking at it right in the middle of the screen, but it's not this really cool high elevation valley with the curved end. Pretty neat feature. The Sinking Creek Valley, it probably deserves its own video. What we're here to talk about is much more subtle, and its subtlety is one of the reasons that it's so interesting. It's just visible here as kind of a dark line that runs along the edge of Sinking Creek Mountain. It's dark because it's got pine trees growing on it preferentially. If we were to zoom in here, which we will in a moment, you'll see there's kind of a little bump or like a little hump or ridge in the landscape there. Really rocky, covered in these pine trees because the soil is very poor, and it's very extensive along the edge of the mountain there. In fact, if you give it a measure here in Google Earth, kind of follow those bends along the ridge there. 26, 27 kilometers. It's a little bit over 15 miles, 15 or 16 miles long, and it's basically a continuous feature along the edge of Sinking Creek Mountain. So what is this thing, and why is it worthy of its own YouTube video? Got a really cool story behind it, and as it turns out, it could be one of the more significant geologic features that most people have never heard of here on the East Coast. And as we start to zoom in here, I don't know. There's not a whole lot really to see in Google Earth other than the fact that you got these pine tree covered bumps along the face of the mountain. Now, most mountains in this part of the valley and ridge tend to be pretty smooth on a face like this. It's because they're developed on tilted layers of sedimentary rock, and the land sort of follows the tilting of the layers. So it's a bit unusual to see a bump like that in the landscape. If we turn on some LiDAR here, we can actually start to get a little more information about what this thing might be. And so we'll zoom in to what's a pretty good spot to get the overall idea here. Of course, LiDAR figures very prominently in a lot of what I do on YouTube, and that's largely because in the Appalachians, everything's got trees and vegetation on it, so it can be very difficult to see geologic structure in the way that you might in the Rockies, for example. And what you want to look at here is tilted sedimentary layering that goes up here, and it just sort of stops abruptly, and then you got more sedimentary layering, but in a very different orientation, right? So you got one set of layers like this, and then you got a set of layers like that sitting on top of it. I will actually label those here just for ease. So you got layers tilting down the slope, sort of like you'd expect, like that. And then you got this kind of boundary line here, and then up above that, layers tilted in a really different fashion. So there's been some kind of breakage of the rock layers here. And as it turns out, this is actually the result of a really huge and very old, but no one knows how old, and that's kind of part of the point of the video, landslide. You would call it actually a block slide officially in geologic terms, because even though it's a landslide, the mass of rock, like the layered mass of rock, sort of held together in terms of its layered structures. So it's almost like a geological fault with big masses of rock moving, but it absolutely occurred along the flank of the mountain. It happened after the mountain had been exposed largely as you see it today by erosion. And for that reason, it's definitely classified as a landslide feature. So, how does anyone even know this thing was here? It was actually discovered in the 1980s. USGS, U.S. Geological Survey geologist named Art Schultz was working down in this area, and he took note of these layering relationships. Now, he couldn't see it with LiDAR like this. He could see it with aerial photography, and he could actually get out and walk around on the ground here. And he sort of put two and two together, and it actually reminded him of a place in the Front Range in Colorado where there are some absolutely enormous, giant block slides of this type where layers slid down and then they kind of like push up at the bottom of the sliding point. It produces this measurable geologic layering distinction that we're talking about here. And this, to him, was a similar example to that. And it turns out he was absolutely right. And it's a really an amazing piece of geologic interpretation to be done without the advantage of the LiDAR imagery that we've been looking at here. But this is of course not any ordinary landslide, and even in the context of the features in Colorado that inspired it, it's massively large in terms of its length by comparison. We bring the LiDAR back in, you can see that it just goes and goes and goes here. We can zoom out a little bit and just what I've kind of patched this LiDAR together on here. You're looking at 9 miles, about 15 kilometers, a little over 9 miles of continuous slide there. And of course, where my LiDAR cuts off there, the slide keeps going for a considerable distance. So it's really a remarkable feature. There's not anything like this anywhere else in the Appalachians of this scale. There are a few things similar to it globally, but to my knowledge, none of them are as long because this is, for all intents and purposes, an unbroken slab of material that has shifted here on the side of the mountain. What what does that look like geologically? It's kind of hard to visualize. There's some types of landslides that you can look at, and it's pretty obvious where something came down and piled up at the bottom of the mountain. This one's a little bit different, and it's particularly distinct, of course, because it involves geologic layering, and that layering actually getting kind of wrinkled and folded by landslide movement. So it's pretty interesting, and of course, it merits a really good diagram. So we'll pop out here to Microsoft Paint, draw this thing up, and hopefully that will give you a better idea of what we're talking about here, what that LiDAR is showing you, and it'll set the stage for talking about why we should actually be pretty interested in what happened on the side of this mountain sometime in the geologic past. So hang on just a minute. Okay, this is a cool diagram here. One of my favorite places in the Appalachians, one that I have done a fair bit of work in over the years, and one that really just like it never disappoints. It's always cool to go look at this feature in person. Always cool to look at the LiDAR, and particularly to think about how something like this might have formed during whatever event or series of events actually did cause it to develop way back when. So we'll get our block diagram started off here. Pretty simple design there. Just got a mountain here, and why is the mountain there? Well, we're going to have this tilted sequence of sandstones that are sort of like propping up the ridge here, adjusting the tilt or the dip on them there, because that's actually a pretty important part of this diagram and actually making it look right. Okay, so basic idea. I'm gonna leave most of this black and white, but I will color that sequence of sandstones there, that is sort of harder to erode, and that's why you have the mountain there to begin with. Okay, I will take it a step further and add one really important layer to that sequence. And it doesn't need to be thick, but this is going to be our layer of shale that the slides are actually going to move on. The key point to making this type of geologic feature is that you need a weak sliding layer that allows a big old slab of sandstone to break free on and move as one, right? So it's not breaking apart and tumbling down the mountain. You need a gigantic slab to move as one on a very weak, slippery surface, and that's going to allow it to kind of run down the mountain, as we've been talking about. What would that look like? Let's knock it out. So we're going to have, it's going to break free through that red layer, and so great is the weight pushing down on the slope, and so weak is the red layer that it's actually going to allow that whole big slab to kind of pop out like that. Let's see if we can do a little bit better job there. I like that pretty good. So with the eraser here, I'm going to tidy that up just a little bit. And now we're going to have our sort of after the slide setup. And with the editor, we'll kind of playback, make a playback out of this and kind of put it in motion. Cool. Okay. So interesting detail to add to this is that some of that slippery layer is going to get carried up with it like that. And we're going to be zooming in on this here in a moment. All right, looking good. So we'll go out here and we're going to finish out. Here's kind of our big slide feature. It's kind of left this gap where it slipped here. And as we draw on it here, it's actually going to be making its own topography because it's pushed up at the bottom, like you see there. Out beyond the slide, it's kind of business as usual on a mountain like this with these tilted sandstone layers. You're going to see these triangles pointed up slope. Call those flat irons, and those are a product of stream erosion kind of cutting into those tilted layers. So we'll have our background mountain shape here going on, and we can even give ourselves kind of a stream coming down through that. All right, cool. So there's the basic setup, and it's actually that easy. Tilted layers. There's a weak layer in there that just can't stand up to the stress. Everything above that weak layer slides, and because the sliding layers are so thick and so deep inside the tilted set of layers, it's going to push up and make that big hump there. In some places, it looks like these slides might be 500 feet thick. And that's just what's left today. They might have even been thicker, and some of it may be gone to erosion. It's about 150 meters, something like that. Really, really, really big, and every bit as large as the actual geologic folds that you see in the valley and ridge here related to the squeezing that made the Appalachian Mountains. So that was initially kind of a mysterious feature related to these. Is like, are they some kind of like a mountain assembly feature, or did they come afterwards? And now, of course, we know for sure because of the way they interact with the landscape that they did come afterwards. So let's see, what can we do here? Should probably zoom in at this point. Got the overall setup. Tell you what, before we zoom in, talk real quickly about what a lot of them look like today. What I drew there, that big old kind of humpback shape, you don't really see that. Most of what I've shown you so far uh, looks more like something like this, where there's kind of a steep edge, almost a cliff face, and in fact, we can take that little layer around and actually have that kind of poking out right there as cliff. So this is more of what you actually see the slides looking like today. And it's not uncommon to see down below them, there's kind of this like pile of material, almost like lobes of material that has fallen off of the edge there, right? So hold that thought. We're gonna go to Google Earth and we'll see how I'm doing here. Bring the old LiDAR in. Let's see. We'll do something like right here. So we'll give Google Earth a minute to catch up here. It ain't gonna like me panning around this fast. Hey, all right, there we go. So what am I drawing for you? Something kind of like what you see there in the middle of the screen, right? So hold that thought. There we go. That's the big idea there. So let's zoom in a little bit now that we got this taken care of. Uh what could you learn like if you wanted to study one of these things? Well, interesting aspect of them is that they produce this like depression, call it a sag on the side of the mountain, and that can fill with water if it doesn't have a way to drain. Now, in most places on these slides today, drain very easily. They actually follow creeks and channels out, but there was a period of time where you had that kind of lake there that fills in with sediment. That sediment can preserve material that will actually tell you how old the sediment is. That kind of study has been done. Hear more about that momentarily. So that is a way to actually determine how old the slides are because they ended up at some point having little lakes and ponds on them, and that's an aspect of landsliding in mountains around the world. It's frequent for them to produce some kind of a low area that can actually trap sediment. Now, what do you have going on today? They're old enough that erosion has been doing the thing here, kind of kind of chewing them up. And what you would see today in a place like this, instead of having that lake there, is that there would actually be kind of a stream gorge, and you would probably see cliffs kind of running along it. You would even see the folding of the layers like that. Something like that. Say goodbye to our nice pond there. And instead of the pond, you would just have water coming down, draining into that gorge, and then flowing out down the side of the mountain, kind of like you see there. Some of the gorges, like we're looking at right there, I've done field mapping in those. That's some of the roughest territory I've ever seen anywhere in the Appalachians. The rock is so broken and crumbled that as the stream cuts through it, it's just a certain way that it falls apart. I don't know. Like one of the roughest field days I've ever had was actually coming coming from over here, coming down through one of these gorges, going all the way down the bottom, coming up here, coming up these cliffs, and kind of making a loop like that. I don't know. I would actually not like to repeat that. Most field mapping I do is always really awesome. I always want to go back. That is one that I would be content to never see again. So that's the overall story there. And being able to put together a diagram like that and then actually see it in the LiDAR and Google Earth, really, really awesome. When I first started working in this area, it was right around the time that this LiDAR imagery first came out. It was really, really exciting because these were an even more mysterious feature at the time. There was still debate even as to whether or not they were landslides. And once you had the chance to look at them with LiDAR, it became absolutely clear that they were just really, really huge slabs of rock that had come down the side of the mountain, right? So we'll take it back to the maps now and keep rolling. Okay, so that's the nuts and bolts of big giant block slides. Tilted sedimentary rocks had the tendency to behave like this globally, but again, seeing a length of slide that is this big, and it's pretty well unbroken internally, so it gives the sense that it was all moving together. That's fairly unique. Now, did this happen fast all at once? Did this take years? Did it take hundreds or thousands of years? No one knows. There was efforts to make models of this, to sort of computer model it. Of course, that was done at a time when the technology probably was not there to get a full understanding. I'm not sure if anyone's looked at it since, but one particular angle of interest was the question of whether or not an earthquake might have been involved, or perhaps a series of earthquakes. If you go to this area on Google Maps. You can actually go to Google Maps, turn on the terrain function, and just type in Sinking Creek Mountain. You can see this really funny, lumpy, irregular shape on the face of the mountain. And of course, that's what we've been talking about for this entire video. So even with Google Maps, without tilting the view, whatever else, this feature is so big that it's really easy to see. In fact, you can see it you could argue, I guess, that it might be faintly visible, even almost from like an orbital altitude, just because Sinking Creek Mountain is so distinct in the landscape, and this disruption on its flank is equally distinct. Now, is there anything close to this that has earthquake significance? And in fact, there actually is. Over here towards where the New River leaves the valley and ridge in Giles County, Virginia. There is a Giles County seismic zone. In 1897, I believe, it produced an earthquake. Magnitudes estimated to be pretty high up in the fives, like 5.7, 5.8, something like that. Did a fair amount of damage regionally, and it is known from that there is at least the potential for pretty stout earthquakes in this part of the world. And when you have topography and within the rocks of eastern North America, the Appalachians, earthquake shaking tends to be pretty amplified, right? Because the rocks of the Earth's crust, old, cold, dense, thick crust, kind of like a metal tuning fork. It really rings when you hit it. So there has been interest in trying to connect this enormous block slide landslide feature to some kind of seismic history. And for that reason, if that's what caused it, you would be pretty interested in knowing that, because you would then wonder how big of an earthquake or series of earthquakes would be necessary to do something like that. Is that something that you should be expecting to happen again? I have not heard anyone weigh in on that for quite some time. Certainly, the ground shaking that is associated with a big earthquake is something that can sort of unload the rocks on the side of the mountain and absolutely help them start sliding. But whether or not that is necessary to make a giant block slide feature like this move, I actually don't know. So what else might have caused it? It's been suggested that the ice age climate might have been sufficient. Like I talked about in the drawing, they looked at places when they were first studying this again in the 80s and into the early 2000s. They looked at places where uh, material had accumulated in sort of those low points where the slide comes down and sort of bends and flexes. We can take a look at one of those right over here. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is actually where samples were taken. So let's let Google Earth chill out there. Yeah, so you've got a real flat area. It's almost got a little depression in it there. There's evidence that there was small lakes or ponds, standing water there. They accumulated sediment. That sediment was sampled and dated, and it took you back to the latter parts of the Pleistocene, of the ice ages. So that suggests that the features are pretty old, and it's very possible that something, now there were no glaciers here, but some aspect of ice age climate might have made it easier for this gigantic slide to start making its way down the slope. In terms of what exactly that would have been, I don't think anyone knows. And again, there's been so little study on this feature for so long. I don't think anyone has weighed in with a with the 2020s opinion on that. It's also possible that just with the evolution of the landscape in this part of the world, we'll zoom back out here, fade our LiDAR away. The streams here, like Craig Creek, have been carving down into the landscape. The rock in this valley is shale. It's very easy to erode away. The valley could be deepened by a big stream like this much more quickly than the strong sandstone that holds up the mountain could erode. So you might end up with a mountain that's basically standing up higher and higher above the valley, and maybe it just got so big that it essentially couldn't support its own weight. A lot of mountains that have shale layers in them like this, that's something that is a possibility for them, though it's usually on a smaller scale than what you see here. So there's really no consensus on why this thing is here. No one's ever seen anything like it happen. It's not moving today. There's no evidence of anything like it elsewhere in the Appalachians moving today. There are smaller versions that that have developed in the same way, but again, absolutely nothing really approaches the overall size of this. The only close candidate is up in Elkins, West Virginia. There are somewhat similar slides like on the Tilted Rock side of a mountain there, but they haven't moved as far. They go all the way down to the bottom of the valley, and it's a little more broken and disconnected. So comparing it directly to what you see here is really not the best thing to do. So in terms of why this is here, what it looked like, could you have been standing on a mountain over here watching this direction and actually like seen this thing come down? You know, nobody knows that. And my understanding is that you can adjust the properties of the rock layers involved, and make that possible. Like it's possible that it could have moved quickly and not totally fallen apart, but it's equally possible that it could have moved bit by bit over time. Probably the most interesting detail of it in terms of its motion that you can actually see is how those layers curve, how they were kind of pushed up during the movement during the movement of the slide. In many cases, the slides, as I mentioned, is really thick. So there was like material was being pushed up and out by the driving load of the slide from up the slope, and that might require it to kind of keep moving. Otherwise, it would get itself in a position where it didn't have the oomph to kind of push uphill. Again, that depends on the properties of the materials involved. But until people take interest in this feature again, I don't think anybody's going to know exactly why it's there. It's cool to check out, of course, of Google Earth, Google Maps. You can go on the national map and use LiDAR to examine this thing. But if it formed from some big single calamitous event, do we expect another one of those? And really, there's not an answer. There's not an answer to that. So, like many other features around the world, you kind of wonder why this exists to begin with, and why you don't see other things like it forming today. That raises pretty interesting questions, but until it shows signs of life, I really don't see anybody trying to learn more about it. Now, if you were trying to do some kind of large scale engineering on this side of the mountain, that's not going to happen. This is all national park or private property. No one's going to build a big road here or anything like that. If that were to happen, and there were to be a lot of excavation done into the slide, people would absolutely want to know, A, that it is there, and B, are you going to bring it back to life by kind of excavating and cutting into it? Whether or not that would be the case, I don't actually know that either. There have been plenty of examples around the world of old landslides causing problem with dams, where dams have been built, and either the dam or the reservoir with the water going up and down has destabilized old landslides like this. That's not going to happen here either, but this is a feature that goes to show that you need to be fully aware of what's in the landscape, both in terms of working with it directly, and in trying to understand like how it got there, because it is entirely possible that something could come along and happen in the future, and let us know how a feature like this formed, and we might all kind of be scratching our heads or thinking, "Oh yeah, now that's obvious," when we look back at it. So, really cool spot here in Southwest Virginia. You can drive a road called Hall Road across this thing, and you can actually cut across the cliffs here where the layers are upturned from pushing out at the bottom end of the slide. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Might step out of the Appalachians for the next one, not sure yet, but hope you check it out when it comes out.